My name is Steve Long, and I am the author of Rightly Dividing. Um, and for about the umpteenth time, I am trying to record this video. I've been having a lot of sound issues, and that's why this video has been delayed in coming. I think I finally got it figured out, or at least I hope I have it figured out so I can go ahead and get this video up for you guys. And this is the part where I promised to diagram a passage of scripture, and we're going to kind of see what it looks like in real time here. And I'm going to go over my thought process as I try to do diagramming. A couple of quick notes before we get started. One, I am going to be using Logos Bible software. So if you can see here, I have the Logos Max subscription. So if you do have Logos and you don't see the sentence diagramming module, or it's not in your tools, you probably don't have that tier. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you have to be up to the max tier in order to have sentence diagramming. Second one, I realized after the first couple of times of recording that this video was just way too long, so I'm going to have to break it up into parts. And two parts will be diagramming, walking through this passage and diagramming it, and then the third part, what I'd like to do is show you what to do with that diagram once you get it done. And then a second reason is because the beginning of these epistles can often be highly elliptical, and I just kind of wanted to show you how to deal with the beginning of an epistle, so you can kind of see what you got to do to supply the verb and the direct object at the very beginning. And then also it does have a number of elements that you saw during the written tutorial. We have some verbal phrases, which would include participles and infinitives. And so that's always a good start to pick a passage that's challenging like that. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. And so the first thing I like to do is I like to read through the passage, which I've already done. I'm not going to take the time to read it because it's a little bit long. 7 verses is a lot to put in one breath, but it is a little bit long. And so, what I like to do is I like to find the main subject and the main verb. And I will also, by the way, leave a link in the description to all the parts of the written tutorials if you want to go back through and read them. If you go to the first one, you should have a link to all of them. So I'll do that in the description as well. So our first one, the first thing we need our subject and our verb shelf. And so obviously we know that Paul is the subject because Paul is the one writing this letter. Now, originally, when I first diagrammed this, if you can see up here, this number 2 right there, that just means I have another diagram with the exact same name. Now, that's because I diagrammed it out previously so I wouldn't get stuck on trying to make decisions. And by the way, this took me about 2 days to do this, coming back and forth to it over a couple of different sessions. But anyway, we see Paul here as our subject. And originally I diagrammed it with the word called as the main verb. But then the more I thought about it, the more I said, okay, well, this word called is probably acting as a participle because it seems to be modifying Paul. And so eventually that's the decision I made. But before I did that, I had to go back and change and supply my verb here. And this is an elliptical verb. And so it's Paul writes or is writing, however you want to do this. And from the tutorial that we put any kind of elliptical in parentheses. And then we have to do the same thing for our direct object. So what is Paul writing? Paul is writing the epistle or the letter. So I'm going to fill that in there. And then something else that's very unique. Oftentimes we have who they're writing to, and that is usually the indirect object. But something a little bit kind of weird here is that Paul doesn't even get to who he's writing to until he gets down here to verse 7. So he explains who he is, and he fills in all this other information before he finally says, okay, I'm writing to all those in Rome. And so we're going to jump down here, and we're going to put the indirect object on the line. Now, this indirect object, I know in the written tutorials, you guys are used to seeing the indirect object on the verb, but for some reason, Logos has it to where it connects on to the main line. And so I'm going to use this to connect that. To those. And then obviously we have all as an adjective modifying those. To all those, and then the prepositional phrase also modifying it in Rome. To all those in Rome. And we will get back to the rest of this when we come down. I'm not going to deal with this relative phrase right this minute. And so we're going to just connect it to here. And then I'm going to go back up and connect this to our main line. And this is what I like to do when I diagram. I like to try and get the baseline all set. But I like to get my baseline set before I do any of these other modifiers. And so that's kind of what I've done here. Now we're going to deal with this participle here. And I'm going to come back to this part here in just a minute. But I want to deal with this participle. So it's Paul. He is called, and this is modifying the word Paul. But there's something that Paul is called, and that is to be an apostle. And so what we have here is we have our very first infinitive phrase. And you know that when an infinitive phrase is acting in a noun capacity or a noun function, we have to diagram it in its noun slot and diagram it on a stilt. And so I'm going to pull out our direct object marker here. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this little guy right there. I don't need him because I need a stilt. And then we need an infinitive shelf. And also this does not have a subject. So I can kind of take this and move this down. And then the to be. What is he called? He's called to be. And then he's called to be something. Who or what is he called to be? And he is called to be an apostle. So this is kind of completing the idea of this to be verb right here. And if you remember from the written tutorials, anytime you have a linking verb or to be verb, equitive verb, whatever you want to call it, it's always followed by either a predicate nominative or a predicate adjective. A predicate nominative being the noun, a predicate adjective obviously being an adjective. And so now again, Logos does something a little bit different. They use the double line here for an adjective and the single line for the nominative. And that's okay. I'm just going to use a single line for both predicate adjectives and predicate nominatives. And so we're going to take this, I'm going to put it back and connect it to this guy here. And then we can kind of connect it here. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit to give us a little bit of room. And then we have another unique feature here. We got to deal with this set apart here. And again, this is something that kind of threw me off in the beginning. And if you've read any of my written tutorials, you know that I always suggest keeping a dictionary on hand, whether it be an online dictionary or whether that be a physical copy of a dictionary, but make sure it's a good one. And again, I highly recommend the Merriam-Webster Online Dictionary. I use that. So what did I do? The very first thing I went to was I typed in set apart in the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. And it came up, but it came up as just an adjective. And I'm thinking to myself, well, can set apart be a participle? Well, Merriam-Webster didn't tell me whether it could be a participle or not. I just kind of assumed that it could be because it could be an adjective, and I know participles, when they're modifying nouns, act as adjectives. And so I just simply just Googled, online dictionaries that give that list of participles in the main entry, and lo and behold, what I found was something called the Online Cambridge Dictionary. And I liked it because when I typed in set apart from here, and I'll let you see this, you can see that it says right here, past tense and past participle of set. And I thought, okay, now that makes sense because set apart also seems to be modifying the noun Paul. And so I'm using this as also a participle. I'm calling this a participle and attaching it to Paul. And notice how these are kind of in parallel here. Paul is called, Paul is set apart. And then we get another something here telling us more about set apart. He was set apart for something, and that's a prepositional phrase. It's actually two of them, for the gospel, and then we have whose gospel it is. It's God's gospel. Okay, there we go. And one of the things I do like about diagramming and Logos is that once you connect it, the whole thing moves together. See, I can move this whole thing, and that's what I like. I don't have the only thing that doesn't move is sometimes when you're doing your relative pronouns, they don't completely connect, and so you just kind of have to shift them around a little bit to get them to move. But usually it's okay. But I do like the fact that all of this kind of moves together. So he's set apart for the gospel, and whose gospel is it? It's God's gospel. Now what I want to do is I want to deal with this phrase right here, a servant of Christ Jesus. And this is in a positive phrase because it's not actually renaming Paul. It's just kind of clarifying more about Paul and telling us more about who Paul is. And so that's what positives do. They clarify further or explain further or elaborate on the word or the clause or the phrase that they're standing in apposition to. And so I'm going to go ahead and draw my little line there and get this set down. So let me get this prepositional phrase here. And then, as you know, with the positives, we signal positives with an equal sign. I'll connect it here. And there we go. And so now we're going to come back and deal with this. And he's set apart for something. Again, it's for the gospel. And this gospel is which he promised. And that's the relative phrase that we're going to deal with. And relative phrases, that once you get them in, you take your line and draw it from the relative phrase back to its antecedent. And the antecedent is just the noun or pronoun or whatever it's referring to. And in this case, it would be the word gospel. So I'm going to go ahead and do this here first. Put our subject and our verb. Make it a little bit longer. In this case, our relative pronoun is the direct object, which. And what that's going to do is that's going to point us back to the word gospel. And so what I need to do now is I need to draw my lines. And going from gospel and going over to the word which, the relative pronoun. Okay. And now we learn something else about this promise. He's promised us the gospel, and he's promised it to us in three separate ways. He's promised us the time when it was promised, which is beforehand. Tells us when. He promised it through his prophets, which tells us how. And of course, these are all adverb questions. If you don't remember the adverb questions, your adverb questions are when it's modifying an adjective, it's going to answer whose, which one, what kind, and how many. And if it's an adverb, it's going to answer when, where, why, how, and to what extent. So this tells us when beforehand, tells us how through the prophets, and it tells us where, and that's in the scriptures, in the Holy Scriptures. And so we're going to take all of this and we're going to connect it all together to this verb. Slide that down just a little bit. Now there might be some that say, well, through the prophets tells us whom, through whom. So shouldn't it modify an adjective? It's answering more of how than it is to whom. And so, like I stated in one of my written tutorials, most of the prepositional phrases you encounter are going to be adverbial. Now, they're going to modify another verb in one way or another. Some of them will modify adjectives, but for the most part, nouns or pronouns or something like that. But for the most part, prepositional phrases are going to modify another verb. And so now we have a different prepositional phrase, and it's telling us concerning his son, and then we have a relative clause connected to that. So let's take care of that. And then we're also going to determine where this prepositional phrase is pointing us to. So we have concerning his son, but we got to determine what is this modifying? What question is it answering? And if you go back and read the text, and this is part of diagramming and it's part of careful reading. And sentence diagramming, you don't just want to slow down. You want to slow way down. And you want to kind of take note of where everything is and what everything is doing and how it's functioning. Again, you're going to have to make some kind of decision if it could go either way. But in this case, I think it's modifying the gospel. Okay, and I'll tell you, because it's something, it's answering something about concerning. What is it concerning, or who is it concerning? And it's answering kind of it. It's the gospel about his son. But when I sat back and thought about it a little bit, okay, this is the gospel of God, which he promised, and this is the gospel that concerns his son. It's about his son, so it's answering who, I guess, is the easiest way to put it. For me, it just seems to be answering, which gospel, and it's the gospel concerning his son. And then we have this other relative phrase here that we're going to go ahead and take care of. And then when we do this relative phrase here, we're going to stop there, and we're going to come back and finish the rest of the diagram in another video. So let's read it a little bit. It says, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. So we got a mouthful here, but what we got going on is we have the subject who, which of course is pointing back to the Son here. And then we have a compounded verb. We have who was descended and declared. And so we're going to need our little rocket shelf here, which is what I like to call it. And I'm going to widen this out so that I can get both these verbs on here. Who was descended. And so we're going to come back to these prepositional phrases. And was declared. And now we can take care of these prepositional phrases. So he was descended. How? Where was he descended from? He was descended from David. And he was descended according to the flesh. Wrong one, my bad. And this, I'm going to take this object here, the flesh, and put it first, and then lengthen that out some so I have room, because this according to here is acting as a single preposition. I don't believe it's two. I believe it's acting as one. That's something else that we dealt with in our written tutorials. But then also we have he was declared to be something, and he was declared to be the Son of God. And so we have the exact same setup that we have here, except instead of being to be an apostle, it's to be the Son of God. And so what we need then is we need our direct object, and we're going to need a stilt, and we're going to need an infinitive shelf, and then the last thing we're going to need is we're going to need this predicate nominative marker. And then we have another prepositional phrase here. Well, let me go ahead and attach this here. Quite long. So let me see if I can move this over a little bit. So he was declared to be the Son of God. Obviously, that's modifying the word son. And then it tells us a couple of different things about how he was declared. First, it tells us I'm going to need that later anyway. First, it tells us the realm in which he was declared, and the word "in" can indicate a physical location or a location that's like a sphere or realm, and it's in power. He was declared how? According to the Spirit of holiness. And so, again, according to is acting as a single unit. So I'm going to go ahead and put this Spirit here. And then the Spirit of holiness, as prepositional phrase, is modifying holiness. It's telling us which Spirit, and it's the Spirit of holiness. And then it's telling us again how, or the means or the manner, whatever you would like to call it, by his resurrection. And then this is where our little shelf is going to come in here. And it's his resurrection, but it's also a resurrection telling us where he was raised from, and it's from the dead. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of hook all this together. I'm going to take this here and move it down here. And we're going to connect this with sun. So I'm going to take this here and move it over and draw my line. Whoops, I did a curved line there. Yeah, I don't have steady hands, so I could never be a doctor. But this goes from sun. And I do want to make sure that I'm not impeding upon any of the other elements here. So guys, that's where we're at for the time being. That's where we're going to stop. I know the video was probably a little bit monotonous, a little bit dry, but that's part of diagramming, and it's part of studying the scripture. If you got any questions, leave them in the comments below. I'll be glad to answer them. If you think, I did something wrong, disagree with me, okay, fine. But there is one little caveat. I am not diagramming this according to the Greek grammar. I am only diagramming it strictly according to the English. And that's how I have it diagrammed here. Because ultimately, there's going to be some people that say, well, this is really this in the Greek and this is really that. Yes, I know that. I've actually diagrammed this passage fully in the Greek. I have a tendency to do that before I ever do it in English. But I wanted to just do a demo of how in English I would do it and how the thought process that I would go through. So thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned for the next video when we finish the diagram.